Good morning, everyone. Beautiful things are often made in secret. Beautiful things are often made in secret. The way that a cell, an embryo, unwraps itself in the womb of a mother, forming the bones, the organs, the skin, the mind of an infant. Other things that we're really familiar with and seem cliche, like an insect or a butterfly that wraps itself up in a chrysalis, emerges beautiful sometime later, but becomes that in secret. A diamond is formed deep in the mantle of the earth under great pressure and heat and comes out one of the most beautiful stones that we have. Beautiful things are often made in secret. But beauty in our world and almost unimaginable suffering oftentimes are side by side in our lives. The beauty of the birth of a child that was formed exists side by side with the loss of a child who was supposed to be born. The beauty of a creature, any given animal, the beauty of any given day exists side by side with the terror, the fear, the death that can be brought from a virus or an ocean that can at a moment's notice overtake a ship and take a father and a brother. The beauty of human creativity and potential to make a symphony or to knit my daughter's lovely Christmas sweaters exists side by side with our ability to make weapons of mass destruction that can take the lives of millions in an hour. Beauty and suffering in our world oftentimes exist side by side. And I'll be preaching 3 weeks during this Advent. I will not be here with you next week. But those 3 sermons that I preached, I kind of gave them a header title called Dawn Will Break. Dawn will break. Because Advent, as I said earlier, it leads us into what is physically the darkest time of the year. And after that darkest day of the year is when we celebrate Christmas. After winter solstice, we celebrate the coming of Jesus, the coming of the light. And at the time of the birth of Jesus, at the time that the story that we read from Luke was written, the Jews had endured over 400 years of darkness, 400 years of prophetic silence. The last book of the Old Testament is Micah. Right? And Micah was written, again, about 400 years before the birth of John the Baptist. And during this time, the Jewish people suffered deeply. They suffered deeply, unimaginable suffering. They, for one short period, gained independence of about 6 years, but for the rest of those 400 years, longer than the existence of the United States, they were under the rule of multiple empires, trying to keep alive their faith, their tradition, their identity as a people. Throughout those 400 years, generation after generation, every empire tried to tear them apart, have them lose their faith, this trust that they had from the scriptures, that God had a special purpose for them. 400 years, older than the existence of the United States. Imagine having the words of the prophet Micah in your head. And you, O tower of the flock, hill of the daughter of Zion, to you shall it come, the former dominion shall come, kingship for the daughter of Jerusalem. These promises, these hopes were present in every Jewish boy and girl's mind from early on, but instead of seeing a kingship of Israel, all they saw after 400 years was Rome. Rome and Herod, who is mentioned in this story. Herod was a king. He had reigned for about 30 years over Judea, but he was really just a Roman pawn. The Romans had placed him there to basically keep the Jews subdued, keep them from rebelling against the Roman Empire. He was a really deeply paranoid ruler, so paranoid that he had 2 of his sons murdered because he was afraid that they were going to try to overthrow him. Right? Deeply paranoid ruler, King Herod. And Augustus would have been the emperor at this time, the first emperor actually of Rome, which prior to this had been more of a republic, but now it was an empire. And most of the world under Rome was at peace. Rome was at peace partially because their military strength made sure that no one would ever think to try and rebel against them. It was in this setting, in this period, after 400 years of waiting for God to do something and believing these promises despite no evidence being given, that we see Elizabeth and Zechariah appear. They're described in Luke 1 as being righteous in the sight of God, following all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blamelessly. Following all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blamelessly. Really a beautiful sight of the faithfulness of a couple that week after week, year after year, they were keeping this flame alive. And yet we find out that Elizabeth is barren, which is a serious, deep problem, which is hard for us to fully reckon with, though if you or a family member have experienced this, you know that it's painful in and of itself. But in the Jewish context, it had even more significance, because if you were following all the laws, if you were doing what Scripture here says that they did, you were supposed to be fruitful. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 12 through 14, says this, "And because you listen to these rules and keep and do them, the Lord your God will keep with you the covenant and the steadfast love that he swore to your fathers. He will love you, bless you, and multiply you. He will also bless the fruit of your womb." And a little bit later, "You will be blessed above all peoples. There shall not be male or female barren among you or among your livestock." And so to be barren was indicative that for some reason God was withholding this blessing with you, from you. It was a curse. Perhaps you've done something wrong. It existed side by side, though, for them, for Elizabeth and Zechariah. This painful, shameful condition existed side by side with really the beauty, the goodness of their marriage and their testimony and their faith. So the question that they, no doubt, had been asking for their whole life was, why was God not blessing them? Why is God not giving them a child? Why is God not rescuing Israel? 400 years. Why is God silent? No prophets, no other prophetic books in Scripture from Micah till the Gospel. Why is God silent? And what I think this story begins to demonstrate is that God, though there is silence, that God is at work in the silence. God is at work in the silence. Look a little bit further at Zechariah. Zechariah is a priest, and there were 24 divisions of priests. They served for just 2 weeks during the whole year. His job took a day or two during the whole year. Very important time. And he's given this honor of burning the incense in a room called the Holy Place. And in this second temple, which was built by this man Herod, there was a veil between the Holy Place and the Holy of Holies. Right? So in the Holy of Holies, they believe that that's where the presence of God tangibly existed. There were stories of priests going in and getting too close to the Holy of Holies and actually falling dead and having to get pulled out because they got too close to the presence of God. It was kind of a terrifying thing. So Zechariah has this very important role to play in this year. I imagine that he's a little bit excited, a little bit terrified, and it turns out for good reason, because an angel shows up. And I have no pictures of Gabriel for you because I have no idea what an angel actually looks like. I was reminded while preparing this sermon of the series, some of you are going to smirk, but Touched by an Angel, where growing up I would see week after week angels appearing in really normal clothes. And I have a suspicion that given Zechariah's reaction here, it's probably not what the angel looked like. Zechariah is terrified, right? He's shaking in his boots. And the angel tells him, identifies himself as Gabriel, which actually would have been more scary, because Gabriel, the only 2 times that he's mentioned in the Old Testament by name is when he's interpreting prophecies about the end of the world. So that's a little bit ominous. Okay, angel, maybe I should be excited. Gabriel, I'm not sure anymore. And Gabriel actually cites Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament. If you read Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, it says this: "Look, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord arrives. He will encourage the fathers and their children to return to me, so that I will not come and strike the earth with judgment. The great and terrible day of the Lord, so that I will not come and strike the earth with judgment." These are the verses that Gabriel is actually pulling to mind for Zechariah as he tells him that his elderly wife will somehow have a child. And I cannot understand this, but perhaps if I was in this situation, I would just say silly things too. But Zechariah gets up the nerve to ask, on what basis do I know this? He's looking at an angel in front of him. How do I know, angel, that has appeared miraculously before me, that what you're saying is true? Sometimes our talking gets in the way of God's working, right? Sometimes our talking can get in the way of God's working, and so Gabriel shuts Zechariah's ability to speak. So for the whole pregnancy of his wife, he cannot speak. I think this is really interesting because when Zechariah now leaves the temple, we can kind of fuse the whole story together, but put yourself in the shoes of the people who were waiting for him. They're all wondering. They all, like Zechariah, have been waiting for 400 years for God to do something. And we have just learned through the story that it's the end of the world as they know it. And they have no idea. Zechariah is completely silent. Nobody in the entire globe knows that God is about to end the world as they know it, except for this one person who cannot speak. We often fail to believe and trust that God is at work in silence because we cannot stand it. And I think one reason we cannot stand it is because silence requires surrender. Silence requires a kind of surrender, a kind of trust. There's a story told by Henry Nouwen of a friend of his who had been a social activist. This friend of his had done amazing work for the poor throughout his life. And at about 53, he had contracted some form of cancer. And over the next 3 years, he became increasingly unable to do the things that he used to do. And he said to Nouwen this. He said, "My whole way of thinking about myself is in terms of action, in terms of doing things for people. My life is valuable because I've been able to do many things for many people. And suddenly here I am, passive, and I can't do anything anymore. Somehow my friend," Nouwen says, "had learned to think about himself as a man who was worth only what he was doing. His hope seemed to rest on the idea that he might get better and return to what he had been doing." Right? His hope was misplaced here. Silence requires surrender. Nouwen goes on to describe what hope looks like for this man and for us, what it looks like to wait, to surrender, and to be willing to endure silence, trusting that God is at work in it. He says to wait with openness and trust is an enormously radical attitude to take towards life. It's choosing to hope that something is happening for us that is far beyond our own imaginings. It's giving up control over our future and letting God define our life. An incredibly difficult thing to do, right? Silence requires surrender. It requires choosing to hope that something is happening for us far beyond our own imaginings. And God is at work in this silence of Zechariah. No one else hears from God at this point in the story. But God is also at work in secret. Right? God is at work in secret. Because we turn to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth experiences this miraculous thing happen in her body. She should not be able to get pregnant. And of course, I've known people, friends, family, who endured this and frankly, at times, been told by doctors, there's no way that this is ever going to happen for you. And of course, right after the doctors make their pronouncement, that's what happens. But for many, it does not ever happen. Elizabeth experiences this miracle. And now combining what Zechariah has heard and what Elizabeth has heard, again, imagine being one of those people outside of the temple, right? So far as you know, nothing has changed. Elizabeth hides herself away for 5 months. It's like God is doing the most amazing thing ever in the history of the world, and then he just hides everybody. He doesn't tell anybody about it for 5 months. Elizabeth hides herself away. She doesn't tell a family member. She doesn't tell anyone. Right? God is at work in this secret way. If you go look in the history books during this time, Zechariah is not an important figure. Elizabeth is not an important woman, except for the fact that God chose to work through them and in them to bring his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. And one of the most fundamental lies, I think a lie, common sense lie, but one that we believe nonetheless, that prevents us from believing this, that believing that God is at work in secret, is to trust only what we can see. Right? To trust only what we can see. We know that there is more going on than meets the eye, but I think another way of thinking about it is perhaps more than can be observed, right? If we can't measure it, test it, replicate it, it must not be real. Like, yes, I can't see a virus, but I know that it's real because I can see the effects of it. Right? I don't see the laws of physics, but I can see the effects of them. And if we can't see it in some way or measure it, it's not real. And this is all the more true for us as visual people in a culture where we're just getting streamed endless Hallmark movies, which I'm not totally against, but images about what this season is all about. Images, screens. And we just end up believing that that's reality, right? What we're being presented is reality, when actually what could be most real, the most important thing that God could be doing, could be something that is completely secret, is being done completely in silence for us and for our good. But we know from experience, right, that the things that are done in secret fuels what happens in public. Right? What happens in secret fuels what is seen, from winning a lacrosse game to presenting a Thanksgiving meal, being able to prepare all the ingredients beforehand. I think about my son Conrad, who's still in process, and Adelaide, who's still in process, but it's the hours that nobody sees holding them, changing their diaper, getting them potty trained. Those are the things that lead to their flourishing life. What happens in secret fuels what it's seen, and it's why Jesus said to give, to pray, to fast in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Your Father who sees in secret will reward you. I think that the reality of beauty and terror, of pain and joy that exists in our world, it's evidence of a world at war. Right? It's evidence of God's kingdom breaking through our darkness, breaking into the earth that is rightfully his, but that has been marred by evil, marred by our sin, and marred by the enemy. God is at work in secret. And in the book Code Girls, it's an untold story of American women code breakers of World War II. Author Lisa Mundy describes the experiences of several thousand American women who spent the years of World War II in Washington, D.C., untangling, decoding the messages of the Nazis and the Japanese to their diplomatic counterparts. In the run-up to D-Day, which essentially was the turnaround for the entire war, these women created phony, coded American messages to deceive the Germans about where the invasion was going to take place. D-Day, again, essentially turned the entire war around. Their work was often mind-numbingly tedious, looking at pages, reams of pages of numbers that mean nothing and letters that meant nothing, and having to come up with codes, ways to break these codes, ciphers, interpreting what are called additives, extra numbers and letters thrown in to confuse them. They built and operated what were called bomb machines to decode the thousands of messages that were sent from the Germans through their Enigma machine. Cracking that particular machine, the Enigma machine, essentially, historians think, shaved off up to 2 years of World War II. And many of us don't remember, but World War II was one of the greatest, most tragic losses of life in our human history. Millions upon millions upon millions of people lost. And the work of these women hot offices in Washington, D.C. that no one ever saw cut the war short by several years, we think. And when they came back, they were often unable to get into graduate degree programs, of course, and many of them had to just come back and work, whatever job they had previously, maybe raise a family, and for most of their life didn't tell anybody about the work they did because it was too sensitive. And it was actually still relevant for the U.S. to keep these things secret, the way that we broke these codes. What happened in secret fueled what was seen. Most of the public had no idea that the war was actually on its way to being won because of the work that was being done in secret. What happens in secret fuels what is seen. God is at work in the silence. God is at work in secret. And I think, though, there's also another challenge to us, to our family, to our friends, to the world in general, to believing these two things. And I've referred to it throughout this sermon, and it's just the simple, unalterable fact of suffering. Right? Suffering is, I would say, in our modern world, the greatest stumbling stone, the greatest difficulty, the greatest obstacle to believing in God. In verse 18, I think what we see, I kind of made fun of Zechariah a little bit there, but I think actually Zechariah is not just saying silly things. I think what we see in his response to an angel is a man who's carrying 400 years of suffering of his people in his bones. Right? He's carrying the tears of his wife cried night over night onto his shoulder with him. And so when an angel shows up, of course, he's almost unable to believe the angel, and he has to ask, on what basis do I know this? On what basis can I believe what God is telling me? One of the biggest challenges to the faith of our friends and ourselves to having hope in this season is suffering. And this is all the more true this year, all the more true in the years to come. But I want to impress upon us, right, that as we continue in Advent, that we not try to escape the suffering. Right? The screens, the messages that we are given many times lead to escaping suffering rather than going through it with God, rather than walking through it with our family, rather than journeying through it with our friends. If there was ever a time in our lives to move beyond like a superficial celebration of this season, to press into the darkness with hope, it's right now. And so, 3 very simple ways we can draw these out over the coming weeks, though. 3 really simple ways that I think we can come back, that sense of hopelessness that can overcome us when we're in suffering, are to be faithful. Right? 1 is to be faithful. In Zechariah and Elizabeth had prepared themselves. There's a reason why God chooses this particular couple. Week after week, year after year, already in their old age, despite apparently being in some way cursed by God for all they know, not being able to have a child, they're still serving in the temple. Zechariah shows up. It's being faithful in the small things. Right? We might not be able to feed every hungry person at this moment, but we can continue to deliver bread to common grounds. We can continue to serve the children that we can at Koinonia. We can continue to love and forgive our family members that live with us in our house. We can continue to make the phone calls, which are really difficult to continue to make after 6 months of not seeing someone during the pandemic. We can be faithful in those small things that will help us to have and continue to have and to give the hope of Christ during this season. We can be faithful. Another one, I think, is to be a good listener. Right? To be a good listener. A little bit unlike Zechariah, who was unable to listen to the angel, but I think we should be good listeners to God, being able to sit in silence, to make space for God to speak. We might not be Gabriel, we might not have an angel, we might be the people outside of the temple who never hear God speak, but making space for that silence and being able to press into it will help us to be good listeners. And just speaking from experience here, there was a season of my walk where I spent lots of time in silence. It was just a particular practice of prayer that I still don't do it. I don't do it now as much as I did during that season. But one of the things that emerged for me through that season of prayer and increasingly silent prayer were all the doubts that I had about God's reality, about God actually being there. Because when you're sitting in silence and nothing in particular happens, the doubt can creep into your mind, maybe God's not actually here. I'm waiting for God to say something, to speak, to stir a thought, but nothing is happening, right? But actually it was pressing through that silence where I began to be able to see even more how God was at work all around me in ways that were not in my control and things that I had nothing to do with. So being good listeners to God, but also being good listeners to others. Right? Being good listeners to others, not trying to distract our friends and family from whatever it is they're going through, but listening to what it is. What are they suffering through? What are they carrying? What are they carrying in their bones? Being good listeners to others. And the third one is to care for the hope that is within us. Care for the hope that's within us. And here I really just thought about Elizabeth. Right? Elizabeth, you would think, is kind of doing something a little bit irresponsible, right? She just got miraculously pregnant. Go tell your family. They need to hear some good news. But actually what God wanted Elizabeth to do was to take care of the hope that was within her, because that hope was going to feed other people. And I think in the franticness of this holiday season, even though we might not be able to do a lot of the other things, we can get swept up in doing, when God might really be asking us to care for the hope that's within us. That might be a dream. That might be something that you want to do in a year. Something that you've barely been able to hold on to because the pandemic just seems to be going on and on and on. And for us, I think to hold on to the hope of Christ, to carry that light forward, is to take care of that hope that's within us. Take care of the thing that God might be giving birth to in us. Be faithful, be good listeners, caring for the hope that is within us. And as we wait this Advent, as we go through the next 4 weeks, suffering, silence, or solitude may try to overwhelm us. The silence might be deafening. Not seeing can cause us to doubt. But I think that when we gain the perspective of Advent, the perspective of a people who waited 400 years, the perspective of a couple that waited their entire life and lost all hope, we can trust. We can trust from this account, from eyewitnesses who pass this account on to us, that God is at work in the silence, and that God is at work in secret. And ultimately, we know this because God did not just give us hope from afar, but He entered our silence. He entered our suffering. He entered the secret place of a womb. And if you're willing, He can enter your life. He can enter your suffering. He wants to enter the secret place with you this Advent. God is at work in the silence. God is at work in secret. So have hope. Let's pray together.